Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Economic Briefcase. I'm your host, Luvinda Wazoka. Today with me in the studio is no other than Mr. Noah Njapao, our co-host for this wonderful program. How has been the week?
Good evening, Doc. The week has been just long, very tired, but it's been okay. Good evening, viewers.
Welcome. What are we discussing today?
Today we're talking about the budget, post-budget analysis.
So the Honorable Minister responsible for Finance on Friday presented the proposed expenditure and revenue measures for 2023. And today in the studio we have two wonderful gentlemen whom we are going to introduce to you very soon to make you understand who is the winner, who is the loser, and who stays at the same level according to Pareto theory. If you know what I'm talking about. In terms of Pareto optimum or theory, there's a change or there's an improvement in an economy when you make at least one person better off without making another person worse off. Mr. Njapao was just trying to ensure that I remember my lecture for tomorrow. So today, as per tradition, we are going to start with what's obtaining on the commodities and foreign exchange market. Honorable Njapao, over to you.
The market update. As of today, the 16th of October, 2022, the kwacha against the four major currencies. The dollar closed off selling at 15 kwacha, 18 ngwe. The pound closed off selling at 17 kwacha, 74 ngwe. The euro closed off selling at 15 kwacha, 56 ngwe. The rand closed off selling at 88 ngwe. Selected metal prices delayed by a day. Aluminium closed off selling at $2,352. That's per barrel. Copper closed off per ton, sorry, I beg your pardon. Copper closed off selling at $7,679.50. Zinc closed off selling at $3,044. Lead closed off selling at $2,036.50. Tin closed off selling at $20,290. Nickel closed off selling at $22,588. Crude oil prices, WTI crude closed off selling at $88.11. Brent crude closed off selling at $93.65. That's all we had for you on the market.
So we saw from what has been shown that the Zambian kwacha has been losing its position the past 1 week, and crude was also falling. But OPEC has announced that they are going to reduce production by 2 million barrels a day. That is OPEC, yeah, plus one. Yeah, so yeah. Plus OPEC plus Russia, Saudi Arabia being a major driver.
So Saudi Arabia is proposing to sell oil very cheap to Europe and a little bit expensive to America.
Wow, that's that's something of the European Union also coming up with measures or how they can ensure that oil prices are not up. So let's observe how the global politics flow. But as it stands today, OPEC announced the reduction in production of oil by 2 million barrels a day. And what that entails, ladies and gentlemen, is that maybe should the market react to the forces of supply and demand, we expect fuel pump prices to adjust upward. So this is the market that we're living in. Over to the budget. Honorable Njapao, I give you the pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel.
So today, in the studio today, we
have two people for the first time.
Guests. Yes, coming from a background of a wealth of knowledge, finance and economics. Today we have Mr. Liali and Mr. Nasanda. Mr. Liali is an associate director with Deloitte.
So for you to be able to understand why we needed somebody from Deloitte, is that despite the fact that you have a lot of economics in the budget. There are those small tax adjustments that are normally made that we do not understand as viewers or as citizens, but those are normally, explained by people that have vast knowledge in accounts. So you can ask your questions, business owners, viewers, citizens, households. You can ask your questions on our Facebook page. We'll be able to pick them up. You can also send your messages on the numbers that are appearing on the screen. You can also call in. We are going to open the phone lines for you to ask any issue of interest. Make sure that you have the budget before you and for you to be able to understand those. Stay tuned. You can watch us Facebook, Topstar, DSTV. You can also watch us on YouTube. So we are live, globe, the whole globe. I cut you short.
Now, our other guest is a financial expert, an economist, Mr. Nasinda.
It's a pleasure having you, gentlemen. First thing first, as per tradition, we normally ask our guests to introduce themselves. There's no way you can come here and then not market yourself. This is, a digital world, and people need first to understand whom they're interacting with, and also, if for people to know you, so that they can know the type of people that I mingle with. Yes.
Well, first, thank you so much. Good evening, viewers, and good evening to Dr. Winter as well as Noah. My name is Susiku Nasinda. I'm a chartered accountant by training as well as a development finance expert. I'm qualified in ACCA, a fellow of both ACCA and Zika, and I serve as Vice President of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants in Zambia. In my development space, my focus is more on renewable energy, infrastructure, as well as agriculture. So basically, that's me in a nutshell.
Mr. Lwali.
Thank you. Good evening, viewers. Good evening, Doc. Good evening, Japal. Thank you for according me this opportunity to share my inputs in terms of the 2023 budget. I'm a tax specialist of more than 14 years now.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the person that you need.
Having worked for a number of organizations, but the most notable organization currently where I'm sitting, I'm with Deloitte & Touche, where I'm an associate director. Basically, in Deloitte & Touche, I'm responsible for business tax. So anything that sits outside the transfer pricing sits with me. Prior to that, I worked for a multinational organization in the telecommunication industry as a senior tax manager there. In terms of training, I have a Bachelor of Arts in Demography and Economics. And then I have a master's degree in taxation law. It's basically an MPhil. I'm also a certified anti-money laundering specialist. So
wow.
The aspect of there's erosion and all those topical issues, I have an idea.
So we'll start with Mr. Nasinda. 2023 budget in general, what is it all about?
Thank you very much, Dr. Habazoka. On Friday last week, the Honorable Minister of Finance, Dr. Stombeko Msokotwane, presented a 167.3 billion budget for 2023. Basically, it gives details of revenues as well as expenditure, communicating government policy, where government would like to direct its resources. And in a nutshell, there are a lot of positives that have come out of that budget. May I congratulate the Honorable Minister for presenting such a bold as well as ambitious budget. Important to note that it's very, very consistent with his initial budget for 2022. So for us to be able to understand what the budget is trying to communicate, what is important is to understand what is the manifesto of the party in government, what are the key policy directions in terms of the 8th National Development Plan, as well as aligning that to Vision 2030. Now, you will recall that way back in the early 2000s, about 2006, the government of Zambia set out an ambitious plan to become a prosperous middle-income country by 2030. And from that time up to about 2010, 2011, we saw that the country was in the right trajectory in terms of attaining those development goals. The target was that for the first 5 years, the country should grow by a growth rate of about 10%, and then thereafter the growth rate should begin to go higher than that. For the period under review, let's say for the past decade, we have been growing with an average of about 3.3 to 3.5%. So you can do the maths, you see that we are falling behind in terms of achieving that target. But coming into 2022, the minister set out an ambitious plan to try and ramp up the production within the country and also stimulate growth in key sectors such as mining, such as agriculture, such as the social sectors, boosting education as well as health. Now, you will agree with me that for a country like Zambia to be able to attain ambitious targets of economic growth and development as espoused in Vision 2030, there are certain things which should happen within the economy: economic transformation, structural transformation. So Zambia is predominantly a copper-dependent country with over 70% of our export revenue coming from copper. And then also you see that the products that we export, the copper and the agriculture, we mainly export them in their raw form. So that denies us the extra revenues that would come to the country if we were to export those commodities after adding value. So what we need to do to get to those ambitious developmental targets is for us to actually implement what is called structural transformation, being able to add value to our agricultural produce. You've seen in this budget that there's emphasis on processing cornstarch, and there are incentives that have been given towards that. And then also vigorously ramping up production of copper from the current 800,000 metric tons to about 3 million metric tons. 3 million tons. And when you compare that with other countries globally and within the region that have seen growth, for example, in the mining sector, you see that there's been a lot of investment in mineral exploration. So we have seen this year that in the budget, there's a lot of emphasis on expanding the amount of mineral exploration that is there in the country, and there are also incentives that have been given towards mineral exploration. So in a nutshell, basically a very ambitious and bold budget by the minister, which inspires confidence. Are we going to get there? There's a lot of work that we need to do as citizens to help government to achieve its development goals. Thank you.
Mr. Lwali, your general overview, general feeling about the budget?
Yeah, in terms of my general overview of the budget, there are two core things that I'm looking at. First and foremost, the kind of landscape that we're currently in that has coined this budget that we have. And the second part is how the government intends to attain its objectives for 2023. Now, beginning with the first part where we're considering the landscape under which the budget has been coined, there are certain fundamental or key areas that have guided in coming up with this budget. The first one is the aspect of the exchange rate itself. We're operating an environment now for the past 1 year. We've seen a significant improvement around the exchange rate. I think sometime last year, when the government was coming into power, the current government was coming into power, the exchange rate was hovering around 22 kwacha, and currently it's about 16 kwacha. The second thing that has guided in coming up with this budget is the fiscal deficit itself. At the time when the government was coming into power, the fiscal deficit, I think it was standing at about 9.9% of GDP. But over time, this has reduced to about 7.7%, and the government is driving to say, look, we need to have a fiscal deficit that is lower there. Maybe just for context, when I talk of fiscal deficit, I'm talking at the ability of the government to spend and how much it's generating. What is the gap that is there? The third item is the aspect of the commercial lending rates, which which, as things stand, there is an indication that they are likely to go down. And this is underpinned on the premise of government securities that have shown a significant drop, and the expectation that the market will react to that. And the fourth item, which has informed it coming up with this budget, is the bigger item, the ceiling of the IMF deal, which the government managed to get after a long time of trying. Now, on the base of this landscape, how is the government going to achieve what it wants to achieve? I think one of the core focus areas is driving prudence in terms of managing the economy. And in this case, what government will focus in is both the fiscal side and the monetary side. On the fiscal side here, we're talking about government watching its expenditure in terms of public expenditure on goods and services. Secondly, on the aspect of being prudent on the fiscal side, is the element of revenue generation. Because for all activities that that government is driving, there has to be revenue. Money is the key and all that. Third, on the fiscal spread, and in trying to manage that, this aspect of the government to ensure that there's a decline in terms of debt contracting. Then the second item that the government intends to achieve its objectives is through mining. Mining is core, as indicated by my colleague here. The mining sector currently, when you look at statistics, is contributing about 17.7% of GDP in terms of its contribution to this economy. When you look at foreign exchange, again, 70% of that is coming from the mining sector. And government has put that at its core as the anchor of driving this economy, with a very ambitious target of saying in the next 10 years, they would like to see our copper production growing from barely 800,000 metric tons to about 3 million metric tons. So this on its own shows that in attaining or achieving the objectives within the 2023 budget, mining will play a significant role. Then last but not the least, one of the areas that I see in this budget where the government will focus on is on driving private sector participation. And as you will note during in the discussion, as we go on, there are a number of measures that government have put in place or have proposed to put in place effective 1 January 2023 to encourage the private sector participate in driving this economy. So basically, when I put these two and after reading the document, my conclusion is it's a fairly progressive budget. One, on the basis that the government on its own has been consistent over the years, over the past 2 years. When you look at the 8th National Development Plan, you look at the medium-term expenditure framework, and you also look at the 2022 national budget itself. What they have announced is more like a continuation of what they proposed in 2022. And taking all this into consideration, I'm of the view that the budget is fairly progressive budget. But let's see how the prescription will be taken.
Okay. So, firstly, looking at the proposed revenues that are to be raised, is there a clear roadmap that shows how these revenues are going to be raised, first locally and the international market, and from other sources?
Yeah, I think in terms of the revenues, when you look at the budget, I think the core component is a budget of 167 billion. When you look at it, a significant portion of this budget will be the revenues. A significant portion of the revenues in this budget will be generated locally, with about 56% of the revenue earmarked to come from taxation. So the core anchor in this, in terms of our revenue generation, will be taxation, and the expectation is that we should see a number of measures coming into fruition or into the picture to ensure that that revenue is realized. The second source of revenue that the government has enumerated is, of course, debt. In as much as there's a drive to ensure that the contraction of debt is reduced, but look, it's a vicious circle. You can't do with debt at whatever level. But a significant portion of the budget will come from data as well, and then other cooperating partners. So in terms of the clear revenue and pointing where they think the revenue should come, I think they've been very clear. They've been very clear in terms of their measures, and they've been very clear in terms of the assumptions or what would arise from the measures they have proposed from the revenue part.
Mr. Sinda, looking at the budget, last year's budget was 173 billion, up from over, I think, 120-something billion for the budget 2021. Government increased for this year from 120-something billion to 173 for this year's budget. Next year we see a reduction in the budget from 173 to 167. But then again, when you look at this year's budget, government had planned to spend 173, but they still went on and got a supplementary budget of around 22 billion. Making this year's budget around 200 billion. So in terms of you know, expenditure, do we also expect another SAP next year, or what do you think the reduction is all about?
Thank you very much. When you look at the components of the budget, one of the key things that you will notice between the 2022 and the 2023 budget is that the debt component has significantly reduced. Okay, so from about 80 million down to about 50 billion. So that reduction is hinged on what is currently happening. So you will recall that mid this year, around July, August, we sealed basically the IMF deal. And that was a precursor to the debt restructuring negotiations. And because of that, you will note that in that particular proposal, what government is saying is that they would like about $8 billion to be written off completely. And then from there, that will leave the difference between your 17 and your 8. And if you see how much has been allocated towards debt servicing, you will notice that that significant reduction tells you that the discussions, that the government is really hoping for a positive discussion with the creditors. So the reduction in absolute terms, you will see that last year's budget, I think, was about 97 billion. And then this year's budget is about 118 billion. So has the budget reduced or increased? I think in real terms, if you take out the debt component, the movement in the debt, you'll find that our expenditure has actually gone up. So are we going to see this happening next year with reference to the supplementary budget? The main reasons that were given for the supplementary budget was that there have been savings. There have been savings, sealing of loopholes in terms of financial leakages, and also moving expenditure towards priority areas. So removing expenditure from wasteful activities to more beneficial activities. And I think that going forward, looking at the measures that the government is putting in place to manage resources, there might be a possibility, or there might not. I think it's too early to state whether we can get another supplementary budget next year. But just to state that this year, the minister has emphasized that there will be reforms in the public financial management system. He has also stated that there's going to be significant reforms in the procurement systems. And when you look at financial management for public sector as well as procurement, those are the two key areas where we have seen financial leakages in the past. Now, if laws are strengthened in those areas, controls, internal controls are significantly strengthened, you will find that there will be a lot of savings in terms of how much money is spent, and that money can be used and channeled to other beneficial areas of the economy.
Mr. Lwai, you mentioned debt. So when the previous government came into government in 2011, they found a foreign debt of about 2-point-something billion. I can't recall the exact figures for domestic debt, but let's remove domestic debt. So our foreign debt moved from about 2-point-something to 2.9 in August last year. So overall, they borrowed externally about 10 billion. Then together with domestic debt, in total, there was something like the total debt was somewhere around 19 billion. That is both domestic and foreign debt. When you look at treasury bills, they were around 96 billion last year. This year we are sitting around 200 billion. So an increase in about $100 billion in domestic debt, especially raised through treasury bills. Looking at last year, looking at last year and now, I'm looking at figures of government has borrowed about 3 billion from August 2021 to the end of this year, December. The debt is going to be around 3 billion. And for next year, government proposes to borrow 1 billion domestically, and 2.3 billion foreign debt. That is in Kwacha 15.6 billion and over 33 billion outside. So I'm thinking in total by the end of next year would have borrowed 6 billion, versus 12.9 billion that was borrowed in 10 years. So in terms of the rate at which debt is growing, is it sustainable, or it's part of the restructuring process?
Yeah, so at the rate that we're growing, I think the question of sustainability has to be answered by the measures that the government is proposing to put in place as an option in terms of revenue generation. I think one of the core measures that is very fresh in our minds is the issue of the subsidies. Basically, I mean, I'll speak from a tax point. Basically, the implicit subsidies that were primarily on fuel. Fuel, and when I talk of fuel, I'm referring to diesel and petrol. On the basis of a recent note that came from the Secretary of Treasury, he tried to give an indication of how much government was spending, which was resulting in government borrowing because it has to spend on subsidizing the fuel. The indication that we got was on a monthly basis, government was spending about $67 million in the form of subsidies on fuel. And then when you break that down, you realize that about $41 million on that subsidy related to the taxes that they waived off, or rather the implicit subsidies. About 26 million of that was the exchange rate differential and the price fluctuations that the government was suffering, which made up the 67. And the government went ahead to say, look, the 26, let us deal with it. They just remain with the taxes. So assuming that that did not grow, we're talking about $41 million that was being incurred on that. And by the government reversing that decision, where is that money going? That money is coming back into the economy. It is being reallocated to other areas of the economy. Now, if you bring in the question of debt to say, look, the government's drive to reduce on debt, is it sustainable? What is going to fill the void that is being created by not having debt? I think the void will be filled up by these measures that they are putting, for example, the removal of the subsidies. That money will go back into the economy. And maybe it explains why the government today, one of the things that I did not expect in this year's budget was the increase in the CDF allocation from 25 to 28 million. Because I've been asking myself the question, we're getting into an austerity space. But they have increased that. And maybe part of the source of that revenue that will fill in that void is this implicit subsidies that they're removing, and also the element of watching expenditure. When you look at one of the strategies that the government is intending to apply in terms of infrastructure development is by bringing in the private sector to play a role in that. Let the private sector build the infrastructure. But how is the government proposing the private sector to build that infrastructure? PPs, public-private partnerships. And what have they done to attract the private sector to participate in that? From the tax side, there are a number of incentives that they've put in place to attract that. One of them, which is very notable, is the aspect of if you create a special purpose vehicle for the purpose of a PP project, they are saying, look, your corporate income tax rate will reduce by 20% for the first 5 years. Now, when we look at 5 years, it is not guesswork, because the assumption is that what kind of a long-term project will last more than 5 years? By the time the 5 years elapses, you've enjoyed your 20%, the project would have been done by that time. So, looking at all these measures, I think their proposed reduction on the debt may be sustainable on the premise that they've identified areas where they can save and reallocate the revenues in that space.
Also, just to add to that discourse on debt sustainability, there are certain things that are governing the way we are going to contract our debt. First of all, if you look at local debt from the monetary policy point of view, you will see that the rates for treasury bills as well as government bonds have significantly gone down. That shows that the appetite by government to borrow on the local market is going down. So that gives us a lot of hope, because SMEs, private sector, will then have more access to financing, which is critical for them to be able to run their businesses. And also, we have a homegrown IMF program, which is looking at helping Zambia to achieve fiscal consolidation You also note that in the IMF program, the focus then is more on concessional loans as opposed to commercial loans. So that helps to curtail the way in which we borrow, and ultimately enhances the sustainability of how we run our country, especially based on borrowed funds. There have also been strong pronouncements by governments to ensure that contracting of debt should move away from the executive, but it should be something that should be approved by Parliament. I think that application has been made, and that's the direction that we are headed towards. So you can see that there's a lot of commitment from the executive, as well as from the monetary policy point of view, economic management, to ensure that our debt is managed in a sustainable manner.
When I see another issue, I hope you are losing. I just translated your names to Loz. Yes. Looking at the budget also, I've observed that when you look at CDF as the concept is very good, and that it brings economic activity to the level of a constituency. Now, looking at the Public Financial Management Act, the general principles of doing business, was it probably the right, or what should government do to enhance the performance of CDF 2023? Because for 2022, the minister himself has admitted that there were a lot of challenges in implementing that. Do you think, one, it's wise to allocate increased resources to a project that is facing teething problems, and how best do you think it can be rolled out?
Well, CDF is a game changer. It moves resources from central governments to local governments and ultimately to the constituencies, and puts power in the hands of communities to be able to decide their destiny. So kudos to government. I think last year when the minister introduced CDF, a huge jump from 1.6 million kwacha to 25. The concerns were already there that it might be a challenge for those funds to be dispersed within one calendar year, because if you look at where we are coming from, even the 1.6 million, which was previously allocated, you find that not all constituencies will exhaust that within the 12 months period. But reforms are very, very important, and the minister touched that in the budget presentation. There's been challenges with disbursements, and basically it's in the structure of how local government financial management system. So if you look at CDF on its own, very, very good and brilliant idea, and I think we need to support it as accountants, as economists, as community leaders. We need to support CDF and make it work. Is the money enough? I think 28 million kwacha is not even enough, because if you go to some of the constituencies and see some of the challenges as well as developmental needs that are there, they're immense. You need infrastructure for roads, you need to support healthcare, you need to support education, because part of the CDF is going towards support for higher education, development of basic infrastructure within the community. So there are a lot of needs currently, and if CDF were to work at its peak with all the encumbrances taken out of the way, I think we'll come to a point where we realize that these monies may actually not be sufficient to meet the needs of the communities. So what do we need to do? What we need to do is to basically to review local government, public finance. What are the encumbrances? I think a lot of it is coming from the fact that approvals have to be done centrally in Lusaka, while the funds are being dispersed to be dispersed locally. So we need to move power to the local communities to ensure that they are able to make decisions about those funds, and also the procurement process. You find that local communities or constituencies are basing their procurement based on guidelines from ZPPA, which are quite stringent, And for a small contract of, let's say, 500,000 kwacha, or maybe 20,000 kwacha, you may find that the procurement rules that apply to big contracts may not be so appropriate if applied to small contracts. So there's need to review all those things, and those things must happen quickly. The good thing is that the minister has allocated funds and has also shown leadership by putting commitment to ensure that all those bottlenecks are taken away. I'm confident that once we deal with these critical issues that are standing in the way of implementing CDF, we should be able to see a smooth process, and it will begin to work for the people in the manner that it was intended.
Mr. Yunwari, coming to taxation figures, government has introduced a progressive mineral royalty tax for the mines. They have created bands and reduced certain bands. The loss from that is going to be, so if in 2022 we expected to collect about $12.8 billion in mineral royalty tax, this year mineral royalty, or for 2023 mineral royalty, we expect to collect, as a result of that measure, a reduced mineral royalty of about 8.9 billion kwacha. So from 12.8, 12.9 somewhere there to 8.6. Then coming to, pay as you earn, a bit on average, I think 100 kwacha per month for an employee, depending on the salary. And the government intends to lose from these small adjustments about $1 billion. Don't you think maybe it was going to be better to give the relief to the worker in the range of about 3.3 billion that the mines have gotten versus giving reduced, relief to the worker in terms of pay as you earn? Okay. What is your comment?
Okay, so I'll begin with tackling the pay as you earn. Here is what is interesting. I've been observing changes around pay as you earn, I think, for the past 5 to 10 years. And what is a common feature around pay as you earn is that every budget you would have to see that adjustment coming into the picture around the exemption threshold. And year in, year out, being a tax person that I am, year in, year out, we've always tried to say, look, what is the impact of the net pay on the respective employee? What is the impact? For the past 5-10 years, the impact has always been 125 kwacha to 175 kwacha in the pockets of people. And the minute I'll stand there and say, we are putting more money in people's pockets to cushion the cost of living. This time, I think in terms of pay as you earn, there's been a bit of a significant increase in the incremental net pay on a monthly basis on the basis of the adjustments that the minister has proposed. When you look at it, first and foremost, the minister has increased the threshold from 4,500 to 4,800. On top of that, he has looked at the middle bracket and expanded it and reduced the rates to 20%. So when you do a calculation, the incremental net pay on a monthly basis, the maximum that anyone in employment would get is about 425. So if you compare number by number to say, look, last year I only got a 125 as the maximum, today 425. There's an increase. It's a nominal increase because we also factor the aspect of the cost of living that has slightly gone higher and all that. But what I think in terms of the mining sector and whether the mining sector should have been subjected to more tax and provide relief to those in employment, we need to look at the bigger picture and how our mining sector has performed over the years. When you look at the performance, I was very, when I was listening to the minister, when he was giving a perspective, I had to go back to verify that perspective because I thought it's one of those statements where when you're in charge, you want to buttress your point. He indicated that, look, in the past 10 years, Zambia, in terms of the copper production, we have not gone beyond 800,000 metric tons in the past 10 years. So what has happened for us not to grow beyond that? But when you look at our neighbor across Congo DR, it's been growing and it beat us. It's now the #1 copper producer in the country. So what has gone wrong in this space? Part of the reason that is being given is first and foremost inconsistency or lack of consistency in terms of mining taxation policy. There was no stability. And as such, well, the people that were running or the players in the industry were not really interested in any long-term investment into this economy. So with the government coming now and putting all these measures, I think the objective there is to ensure that there's stability, in the sector, ensure that our mining taxation regime is comparable to other economies that we are competing for the same customers of the copper, that we are competing for the same investors. Now, if there is stability, holding other things constant, you're an economy, ceteris paribus, holding other things constant, with reducing the rates and creating a stable environment, the expectation is that we should see more of investment coming into the country. When we have more of investment coming into the country, what happens? We have production increasing. For production to increase, it's a factor of labor. So we have more people getting employed and all that. And we'll have the numbers which will drive the revenue needs from a wider point. So when we are looking at mining and looking at pay as we earn and the impact, we should not detach the impact of what these measures can potentially bring in terms of expanding the mining sector from a growth point.
Okay, so Mr. Masinda, for the FISIP and the replacement of FISIP, we've seen that even the allocation to this has increased from about 5 to 8 billion. What are your comments on that, the replacement of FISIP, which is the Comprehensive Agricultural Support Program?
Thanks a lot. Very interesting question. I think going into the budget, there was a lot of apprehension, especially that we had the IMF deal coming into place, $1.3 billion, and also that created an environment where I think the general populace was unsure about what would actually happen in terms of austerity. To what extent would austerities go? But what we have seen is that certain important aspects of our economic development have been supported fully and actually been enhanced in the new budget. And one such thing is one such area is agriculture. Now, the agriculture sector has an interesting aspect which is called FISIP. This year, in 2023, what the minister is proposing is to amend or enhance the FISIP program, because currently FISIP is limited to what you call maybe your fertilizer and other inputs like seeds, but you realize that this country is vast, and what may work in one region may not work in another, and also because farmers are diverse in nature. The needs of one farmer may not necessarily be the needs of another farmer. So the FISIP, what we have seen is that next year the Comprehensive Agriculture Support Program is bringing in the aspect of a broadened scope in terms of what you can do with that money. So as a farmer, you can decide what you can do. It's not just about getting fertilizer, but you can use the same resources to pay for extension services, for example, and then you can also buy farming implements, which you can use in your farming. Now, the allocation of funding has ultimately increased, and also the number of beneficiaries of FISIP has increased. I think that dispels a lot of fears and apprehension that we saw in the weeks leading to the budget, where farmers and the general populace was thinking that because of austerity, we might see a significant cut towards the FISIP program. So it's a good and commendable thing to do. Why? Because it helps with agricultural diversification, especially crop diversification. Farmers will be able to invest more in cash crops, those crops that are bringing in more money and incomes into their own households and ultimately into the country. So basically, in a nutshell, very, very positive development, migrating from FISIP to the Comprehensive Agriculture Support Program.
Okay, Mr. Liali.
By the way, we have opened the phone lines. You can, you can call us on the numbers that are on the screen. You can also send us your text messages. Very soon we'll start reading your messages. You can call us, ask us any question, and we'll be able to help. You can proceed, Mr. Njapao.
Yes, Mr. Liali. My question was on the VAT, introducing VAT to a number of number of goods. How does that affect an average Zambian out there?
Okay, in terms of VAT, interesting enough, this is 1 year that the Minister of Finance has played very carefully. If you asked me that question before the budget, I had a different view around VAT. And it was building on the IMF document and what it says. When you read that document, first and foremost, when you look at the revenue estimates for the medium-term period, and when I say medium-term period, I'm talking of 2023 to 2025, the period of the agreement, you'd realize that VAT is the anchor in terms of revenue generation. And the IMF have gone further to give a prescription to say, look, first and foremost, you need to enhance your tax administration in terms of collection through fiscalization. And what I mean by fiscalization, I mean bring in technology in the collection of taxation. Then the IMF document further goes, there is need to limit items that are exempt to only items that are really feeding into the food basket that attaches closely to the vulnerable. When I read that, I can assure you my view was, wow, what are we expecting in this budget? Are we going to see a number of exempt items falling into that scope? Are we going to see a number of items that were zero rated going to that scope? Shockingly, the budget has been announced. When I look at the items that are now subjected to VAT, one of the items that I can think clearly is the clarity that has been provided on batteries. And they're saying, look, when it comes to zero rating of batteries, we only mean solar batteries, not any other battery. But again, you need to look at what is the objective around that. We are driving an agenda to go into alternative energy sources, getting it, and the whole objective is that let us encourage use of all solar items so that we can have alternative in terms of energy and all that. In terms of the other bits that I've seen that have been subjected to VAT that were zero rated or exempt, is the aspect of what is called a finance lease and commercial property. So basically what the minister has proposed as part of the housekeeping measures is that we need to redefine what a commercial property is. And that commercial property definition should exclude bare land. And really when you look at that measure, for me, it is a welcome measure because we're seeing people who, you wake up today, you have a little bit of money, you get a piece of land at 100,000, I'm just giving as an example, at 100,000, 2-3 years on the run, you see a Chinese investor, you sell that at 1 million without adding any value. But then the law provided for zero rating of any such, or an exemption for any such. So when I look at the VAT measures that have come into picture.
So in terms of commercial property, just what has happened now? What do we expect?
So what we expect is in terms of selling undeveloped property, yeah, the price will go high to the extent of the VAT. Because if you have land, that definition of commercial property has excluded land or bare land. So basically it's to curtail this behavior of people getting land today and selling it at a higher price tomorrow. So the implication around that is that, look, if you get bare land for the sake of selling it at a higher value tomorrow, come on, give Caesar what belongs to Caesar in the form of tax and VAT. So when I look at the items that the minister has proposed to move away from zero rating and exemption to being standard rated or subjected to VAT at 16%, there is very minimal. There is very minimal. I can't point of anything that is close. The only item that has just interested me on the VAT side is, and I'm yet to really comprehend, is in respect of gambling and betting services. Currently they are subject to VAT at 16%, but the minister has proposed to exempt gambling services. Yeah, he has proposed to exempt gambling services on the premise that first and foremost, collection of tax in that sector was a bit difficult, or applying the VAT. So let us focus on that. The 10 of
how do you even apply it?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I'll tell you it's a challenge. I mean, being in industry, it's something that I've been facing over and over, and there was a lot of uncertainty, because when you look at betting, just to give a bit of context, if I'm a service provider, my real revenue that I'm getting out of betting is when you lose. You're getting it? So you put your stake, you're getting it? If you lose your entire stake, then I've gained. If you win, then I have zero. So the question that was there was, what is even the tax base for VAT purposes? Unfortunately, the legislation was not defined that. So there was confusion. Is it the stake? At what point is it triggered? So there were all those complications that were there. So to simplify the tax, make it exempt, let's focus on turnover. And by the way, turnover is turnover. I mean, if you have 10 kwacha, it's 10%, easy to collect and all that.
So we also the conditions that the IMF brought about. Would it be safe to say that the budget is following that, or it's not, or it has totally diverted from the conditions that were outlined?
Yeah, I think the IMF deal has really shaped the 2023 budget, especially from a tax point. Two core things that I'll pick from the IMF document that you can relate in what has been announced. One of the things that the IMF proposed in that budget is, look, government, unify your corporate income tax rate to make it competitive. And they've given a range in the document. Unify it between 25 and 30%. So what has happened now in terms of the measures, the highest rate that we had in this sector, or that we currently have in this sector, is with respect to the telecommunication sector, of which there's a two-tier tax system. The first 250 tax at 30%. Anything above that tax at 40%.
Wow.
What has the minister done? I think aligning it to what the IMF to say, let's get to 25 and 30. The rate has been reduced to...
Well, our first caller, just hold on to your thoughts. I'm learning a lot. I'm learning. Yes, your name and where you're calling from? Yes, you are through to Camnet TV, Economic Briefcase program. Your name and where you're calling from? Yes. Just hold the phone. Just hold the phone close to your mouth. Hello, you can go ahead. We have lost that one. When you call us, please make sure that you are not on loudspeaker and you hold your phone close to your mouth. You can call back. We'll be able to take your calls. Yes, you.
Yeah, so I was talking about the telecommunication, which I was giving as an example. So there's a reduction of the rate from 40% now to 35%, which I think is a direction heading towards the 25-30%. Then secondly, as I indicated in my opening remarks, I said the 2023 budget is more of a continuation of the 2022 budget. And really, it's one of the budgets that if you sit where I'm sitting, it was very easy to predict what to expect. In last year's budget, the minister announced the reduction of the rate, standard corporate income tax rate, from 35% to 30%.
That is kudos, that is very good.
Which was very good, very positive and all that. And when you look at the prescription by the IMF, they're saying between 25 and 30. And even in this year's budget, there are certain sectors or certain value-adding areas where the minister said, we are even reducing further the rate from 30% to 25%. For example, if you go into the gemstone industry, the drive here is to say, look, can we have value addition? So if you have facilities that are adding value addition to the gemstones, the income that we generate from there will be taxed at 25%, which is within the IMF. Then secondly, one of the items that the IMF is driving as part of their conditions, look, can the private sector drive economic activity? Now, how do you ensure that the private sector drive economic activity? You have to create a conducive environment for that. And one of the key drivers in driving that appetite for the private sector, by the way, is taxation. When you look at the budget, you can start from the aspect of PPS to bring in private sector and the incentives that brought around corporate income tax as well as customs. When you look at what my colleague here indicated in terms of the agriculture sector, agro-processing, the minister said, look, in the multi-facility economic zones, last year I said, if you're manufacturing there, you're exporting. Here are the incentives. But now I'm saying, when it comes to agriculture, if you have corn, which is our #1 product because we're a most producing country, if you have that corn, you operate in a multi-facility economic zone, in an industrial park or in a rural area, and you further process that, and you sell it locally. And you sell it locally, that processed corn. It means that for the first 10 years, of you earning a profit to be taxed at the rate of 0%. Then it will gradually go on to say, look, the next 3 years that will follow, you'll be only 50% of your profits to be taxed. Then for the last 2 years, only 75% of your profits, to encourage more into that. I can go on and on and on how the measures that have been put are feeding into what I'm saying, drive economic activity. So I think the IMF deal has really shaped significantly this budget. As earlier indicated by my colleague around debt, we can see the features, the prescription and all that.
Director, just hold your thought. Let me see if we can get some messages. Director, any messages? Or before we go that, we can pick up our call.
Hello?
Hello, your name and where you're calling from?
This is Mr. Alfred Chinyama. I'm calling you from Somalis.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Rubinda Havatoka, as well as the other panelists there.
Good evening.
I've been following some of the programs that you've been hosting, particularly TV stations. Mr. Rubinda, you are on record to have sided with peers, and you are on record to have failed to advise the peers in terms of economy, how the economy should be run and so forth. Today, peers are on the other side. In other countries, if you follow the budget like the way the budget was presented, people are led like yourself and others should have come up with an alternative budget. This is how things are supposed to be done.
Sir, we have a panel here. Can you ask them a question?
Especially you, the moderator. It's about the IMF program and all these programs.
Sir, we have a panel. Can you ask them a question? Like we are discussing the next year's budget. Anything you want to ask about the budget? Mr. Moderator, how much money was borrowed in terms of treasury bills in the last 10 years? You just compared the external debt. Looking at how government is generating revenue, it is possible for the government to finance the deficit of the national budget by using domestic debt such as treasury bills and government bonds. From Kingford, Kafwaya. Good evening, panel. Can someone tell me how much debt does the country owe in dollars on one hand and in kwacha, which is local, so that people like myself can understand, because most of you economists present different figures. Emmanuel Miti Mufrira. How does VAT affect the Zambian citizen? P from Mulenga. P Mulenga Kitwa. So we start with the VAT. Mr. We'll go to you. The VAT. Maybe various, or we go to the tax.
The taxes, but
yes.
Well, I can say something, but my colleague would come in. VAT is basically a consumption tax. So the one who bears the ultimate burden of paying VAT is the final consumer of the product. Okay, so for example, if I buy a packet of sugar or a packet of salt, I, as a person who is ultimately consuming that sugar or salt, will pay for that VAT. So basically, in a nutshell, how does it affect consumers? How does it affect the population? The tax man is here, is going to give us those details.
Okay.
Maybe before we go to him, you economists, you give different figures on debt. What is the debt position in dollar terms and in
kwacha terms?
In kwacha terms.
Thank you very much. The focus over the last, I think, 12 months has been so much on the external debt. How do we deal with this burden? As at 31st December last year, we had about 17 billion US dollars in terms of external debt, and then the minister has given us an updated figure. As of June, we are starting at about 14 billion US dollars. So that's the direction. You can see that As of December, external debt 17. As of June, right now, about 14 billion US dollars.
On the value-added tax,
Yes.
how it impacts. I think my colleague has explained it very well on how VAT works. It's a consumption tax. Basically, you, the end user, is the one who's paying it. And the entity that is charging you is just a collecting agent who was penalized for not collecting it and not paying it to the tax authorities. So the real impact is that in terms of what you are consuming as a final consumer, the end price will increase. In simple terms, the end price will increase to the extent of the VAT that is being charged on whatever goods or services that you're buying. So that is really the real impact. The indirect impact is that the source of revenue for government is taxation, and value-added tax is one of the sources of revenue for government. So you pay it. It's the same money that will go into servicing public provision of public services, health services, education, and any other public goods that you can think of. Some of them are the items that my colleague was mentioning about this FISIP that we have. Where do you think that money is coming from? Basically, that money is coming from these taxes, and VAT is one of them. So the impact is direct, price increase. Impact is indirect, these public services and goods that we are enjoying.
There was a gentleman who was asking how much did we borrow in terms of treasury bills the last 10 years. For me, I just know the figure that I don't know really on the actual one, but I think it was around 96 billion by the end of by the announcement of last year's budget. So that we were looking at October. By October, it was 96 billion.
Well, I do not have the actual figure, but what we need to understand is what has been happening in the economy. Government raises monies in different forms. One of them is taxation, one of them is through external borrowing, one of them is through domestic borrowing. So when you look at domestic borrowing, there are two main tools that are used. The first one is treasury bills, which are basically when you lend to government within a 12-month period, and then there are also government bonds which go beyond that period. They are longer. So why would government borrow? There are a lot of reasons why government would borrow. If it's not raising sufficient revenues from taxes to be able to meet public expenditure, then it will borrow for revenue expenditure. The other reason would be if government has got capital projects which it would like to invest in, such as construction of roads, construction of hospitals, construction of schools, and also provision of other services, such as communication infrastructure and the like. So the government will borrow in order to invest in those. So the guidance is that your borrowings should be sustainable. They should be within certain thresholds for you to be able to meet the debt obligations in terms of principal amounts and interest payments. So where are we coming from? Where we are coming from is that if you look at the interest rates on treasury bills, for example, and the yields on government bonds, over the last decade, there was a significant rise in terms of government borrowing. So, for example, treasury bills, as at last year, this time, the interest on treasury bills was about 25 to 26%. But what you have seen now is that, those rates have come down. I think we are now at about 13%. So the rate of return, which is the risk rate, will tell you what is happening within that particular financial space. So if the rate is high, it means that lenders, who are yourself and myself and financial institutions, will want to invest more into government bonds and treasury bills because they are deemed to be very, very safe and secure investments because it's believed that government does not default. So how much have we borrowed? I think we borrowed beyond our capacity. We basically borrowed highly, and that can be seen from the rate at which the returns were being given to the investors. For treasury bills, about 25% last year, and now we are at about 13%. So the rate of return will guide how investors will make their investments, because the lower the rate, then the investors will begin to think about alternative ways in which they can invest the money. So the huge infrastructure projects that we had over the past decade meant that our fiscal space was constrained, and therefore we had to borrow more funds locally in order to provide services such as education, health, security, and others.
So the viewers out there, Zambians are thinking, where are the jobs coming in? I know there's about 10,000 jobs that are coming in. We have 4,500 teachers, about 3,000 health personnel. Then I think we have security personnel that are coming in, agriculture extension officers. But what of the accountant and just any other citizen? Any jobs coming in? Where do you think the private sector activity in terms of job creation will come from? I mean, you mentioned about the mining industry. Where else do we expect?
Yeah, so where else do I expect jobs to come in the private sector? I think in the agriculture, sector, I'm anticipating jobs to come because holding other things constant and the measures that the government has proposed, we're expecting to see increased investment in the agriculture sector. Yeah, and that investment would entail the need for labor, of which people like myself, people like my colleague here, including yourself, Doc, the opportunity to be there in the agriculture. I'm seeing that happening, especially with this drive to encourage processing, local processing or value addition on our produce and the like, with now the key landmark, which is the constant processing that has come into the picture and focusing on multifaceted economic zones. The other area where I think employment will come other than just the mines, because for the mines it's already given, so it occurs. If you look at the budget, one of the things that the minister has proposed is to set up another multi-facility economic zone, which will be targeted more on manufacture and processing, and the target market is the Congo DR. Forgotten, is it Kasumba? Is it Kasumba less? Forgotten. Along the border.
We have our second caller. Please, your name and where are you calling from?
Hello.
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 Hello. Good evening. Your name and where are you calling from?
Good evening. Good evening, Samuel.
Good evening.
Thank you. My question is to do with the two items. One is the VAT, and the other one is pay as you earn. I'm thinking to myself that is a clever way of taxing a person who is vulnerable. Because this person who is vulnerable will have to buy sugar, will have to buy salt, will have to buy this other thing, and that person must also pay tax. Whereas he is the person who is working. You can pay as you earn, there is a relief of so much. And if this person you have given a relief, when he goes to the shop, and then he's paying indirectly as he goes to buy, right? So where is the relief? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. A very interesting question there. I'll be quick to mention that there has been no adjustment. There has been no adjustment to the VAT rate in this year's budget. So the fears that the caller is raising have been allayed by the fact that there has been no movement in the VAT rate. It still stands at 16%. And then when you look at pay as you earn is basically earnings, basically tax that you pay on your earnings from employment, those that are in formal employment. And what has happened in that space is that the minister has given further reliefs on pay as you earn. So the exempt threshold has moved up from 4,500 kwacha per month to 4,800 kwacha, and also the tax bands have been adjusted so that the next band is actually starting at 20%. And what that means is that effectively workers or employees will have more money to be able to spend on more pressing areas of household expenditure. So I think if we're talking about the 2023 budget, then the callers' concerns may not be as grave as they are being portrayed, because there's been good relief in terms of pay as you earn, and also the VAT rate has been maintained.
I think if I'm not mistaken, he further talked about double taxation, where he said he's taxed on how much he earns, is then further taxed on the goods he purchases from different stores. So I think he just needed clarity on that.
So if I got the first part of his question is, look, I'll put his question differently. For the vulnerable, what relief is there with this VAT? Because it occurs whether you're working or not working, you still pay VAT. Where is the relief? That's the context. I think I got his question before we move to the aspect of pay as you earn and the other bit of double taxation. Now, the way VAT operates, by the way, it's a well accepted tax worldwide. I can only think of very few countries that do not have VAT and all. But the way VAT is structured is, from a bigger picture point, it has taken into account the vulnerable and tried to mitigate the impact of the tax around them. So how is a normal VAT or an effective VAT system supposed to operate? It's supposed to identify the goods and services that have a direct impact on the vulnerable. And when those goods and services are identified, those would either be exempt from VAT or zero-rated from VAT. So when you look at the basic goods and services that we need on a daily basis, whether you are working or you're not working, things like education services, health services, financial services, transportation services, all those are services that are exempt. And the whole objective around that is to ensure that let the vulnerable have the relief, and that is the relief that is already there in the law. So I don't know if that addresses the caller's call. Of course, and unfortunately, I mean, you'd realize that from time immemorial, one of the oddest things is taxation, and it's either death or tax that you can't avoid, unfortunately.
Very nice contribution. Let me just come in there. I like that aspect. Well, you've explained it very well, how that is a balancing act. But you also note that on individual level, there are some steps that the minister has taken to make our lives much, much easier. The first one is to do with financial inclusion. When you look at the interest that you earn from your insurance products, the withholding tax has been removed, basically from 15% to 0%. And then also the interest that you earn from your village banking income, you'll find that withholding tax has also been removed from 15% to 0. And then also, when you look at reinsurance, the minister has also given incentives for the reinsurance industry. And what that does is that for the waiver of taxes on interest income from insurance, as well as village banking savings, the objective is to put more money in the hands of ordinary citizens, such as Liali and myself. So it means that there are more reliefs that are coming, but may be coming in a different form than what citizens might have expected. But what that would do is that it would drive financial inclusion. As you know, Zambia has an ambitious program. If you look at the Bank of Zambia strategic plan for the period 2022 up to 2025, one of the key areas or pillars of that particular strategic plan is financial inclusion, to ensure that everyone in this country has access to savings, has aspects to borrowing, and also is fairly liquid to be able to deal with emergencies and unforeseen issues. So when you see that the minister has waived withholding tax on financial products, different financial products, especially savings products as well as insurance products, then you know that there's more money which can be used for other investments, and that should be commended.
Director, let's look at our messages before we wind up. Good evening, panel. Why is it that the budget and the IMF documents are confidential? Yours, Livingstone Chondo Ekitwe. In the public-private partnership, is the PPP going to be the best vehicle to improve the economy of Zambia? John from Kitwe. Good evening, panel. Are tractors, value addition equipment, and other agriculture equipment zero rated on customs duty in our 2023 national budget? Chikumbi from Livingstone.
Yeah, so for the last one, majority of agriculture equipment is currently zero rated for VAT purposes as well as in terms of customs. This year's budget, the minister has proposed to expand that listing by including selected machinery and all that to amongst the items that are zero rated for VAT purposes and exempt for customs, which are meant for the agriculture. Unfortunately, at this point, the list is not very clear, not very comprehensive, so we are waiting for the pieces of legislation where we are going to have the specifics and the like. But to comfort the person who sent that, I believe any majority of the equipment and machinery, such as tractors and other accessories that go into agriculture, majority of them will fall within the scope of the exemption zero rating. Is the budget confidential, IMF package? You people are only discussing it alone.
Very interesting question. I think if you go to the IMF website and the Ministry of Finance website for Zambia, the IMF extended credit facility deal is a public document. All the conditions are listed there, what the government of Zambia needs to do. For example, things like enhancing support to social sectors such as education, health, and social gas transfers. Those are all spelled out in that agreement, and that is exactly what the minister has done in the 2023 budget. And then for the national budget 2022, immediately the minister is done presenting, that becomes a public document. So it's there on the Ministry of Finance website, and also key civil society organizations will basically have copies of that budget. So all you need to do is to reach out and be able to request for it. You should be able to have access to it. It's not a secret document, and neither is the IMF agreement.
In conclusion, can PPP drive economic growth? Can it develop the country?
I should think so. I should think so. That is a core alternative in terms of funding, considering the circumstances where we're in. I think it's part of the solution. Not the only solution, part of the solution.
Yeah, just to add on to what my colleague has said, what is a PPP to start with? Public-private partnership. So this is where government and private sector organizations team up to drive development. This is mainly common in infrastructure projects, such as in the energy sector, in the transport, for example, rail, and then also road, and then also in the health sector. If you go to countries like Lesotho, there's been a PPP.
Where did you do project finance?
That's a very nice question. We'll talk about it.
Yeah, you are talking about my notes.
For example, in Lesotho, the largest public hospital, what you may call your university teaching hospital in Zambia, was financed using a PPP. Then when we go to South Africa, if you look at the Gautrain, which is the train system in Gauteng province, which was developed in 2010 to support the 2010 World Cup, was also a PPP. And then when you go to West Africa, countries like Chad, there have been PPPs that have been...
East Park
more is also a PPP. So what is the issue around PPP? PPP means government brings its resources and expertise, and private sector bring their resources and expertise. Now, private sector is known for two things. They are very good at managing resources, and they're also very good at evaluating projects. Is this project viable? So if private sector bring in their financing and then they also invest in a project that is viable, it means that government ultimately will be taking development or making investments that are financially viable and sound. Projects that are viable and will actually bring in a return. So that reduces the pressure on government resources, because if government invests in a road in a part of the country where there's no economic activity, how long will it take for governments to recoup that investment? But for example, there's one road in Zambia which everyone knows can make money on its own. It's the Kitwe-Lusaka road. When you pass through Kapirimposhi, when you go to Ndola, when you go to Kitwe Chingola, all the way through Chilawombwe, this is a road that is busy 24/7, except in circumstances where government has imposed travel restrictions for public service vehicles as well as trucks. So PPP is good. Yes, they are. They are good because this relieves of government to look for monies to be able to invest in projects. So government can then invest in health, can invest in education, can invest in security. As you may be aware, there are a lot of security. There have been security concerns in this country, abductions and the like, and it's good that the minister has promised or committed to recruit 2,000 more teachers. So instead of investing in a road, government can then invest in security and all of us can be safe. So have PPPs been successful everywhere? Not everywhere. There are a lot of key things that need to be put into consideration. For example, what is the viability of the project, and also issues to do with governance of those particular contracts. If you rule out corruption in how you are awarding the PPP, and also the credibility of the private partner, is also very important in guaranteeing the success of the PPP. Ultimately, if what the government of Zambia has done to enhance PPP is, one, the government has said that most infrastructure projects will be done through PPPs, number one. Number two, there's been a PPP Act that has been in place. In 2023, that Act will be reviewed. Okay, there will be a review of that Act to ensure that all bottlenecks, maybe legal bottlenecks, impediments that are there, are taken out, so that PPPs in Zambia become more effective. One such country that has worked very well in terms of PPPs is South Africa. So the government of Zambia can benchmark against countries such as South Africa and others globally that have successfully implemented PPPs. And then also the formation of the public-private dialogue forum will also help to enhance the challenge, to enhance the contribution of the private sector to the growth of the Zambian economy, because you'll find that that particular public-private dialogue forum has got thematic areas, financial services, and all these various thematic areas will bring up issues that are impeding them from being able to participate fully in helping the Zambian government to achieve its dream. So repealing and also enhancing of the PPP Act and formation of the Public-Private Dialogue Forum should ultimately result in enhanced participation of the private sector in the growth. And
being a member of the PPD, I sit on various two thematic groups. I can tell you that discussions that go there, they have a footprint in next year's budget. And I think the major advantage of that is that you make it easy to do business for companies, and when companies have more resources, they're able to grow, they start employing, they pay better salaries, and let's hope that this initiative is going to continue going forward. Ladies and gentlemen, you were watching Economic Briefcase on Kame TV. Gentlemen, it was a pleasure having you. I think our panel today is up. You have learned a lot, personally, I've learned a lot. I wish we discussed a lot of housekeeping measures in the budget. Those when you read them you don't understand, but the experts know what they actually mean. But I'm sure you know about commercial property, and now the implications. I think going forward we shall come and discuss that. We looked at
we can further in the future invite the two gentlemen again to come and discuss on various
the nitty-gritties, the things that actually people do not understand, like how to pay taxes, when you need to pay them, how to treat what is taxable income, how such things, and there are a lot of those measures. I think the last 5 budgets that I've seen, this one has like one of the most housekeeping measures. So, and that's...
I'll tell you one thing. There's one very key housekeeping measure, which I think will change how multinationals look at Zambia in terms of investing. We have a very very misleading or confusing piece of legislation in the Property Transfer Tax Act in terms of indirect transfer of shares. So what I mean here is if you have an entity that is outside the country, which has a subsidiary, maybe if I'm just giving us an example in Namibia, then that subsidiary has a subsidiary in Zambia. When the shares that are seated in the entity in Namibia, as an example, are being transferred, that is considered as an indirect transfer of shares, which is subject to taxation here in Zambia. Now, the issue that was there was in respect of valuation of those shares for the purpose of calculating property transfer tax. The way the law is crafted currently is in such a way that the value of the entity in totality that is sitting outside falls within the scope of the property transfer tax here in Zambia, and you tax it in for here in Zambia. Now, which created a very upset position on the premise that you have a multinational that has many subsidiaries. When you look at this value, it's so much high, and the Zambian entity, maybe the value is just 10%. But when that entity is transferring the shares, the entire value that is sitting outside also being transferred is also being captured in the scope of property transfer tax in Zambia. So what have the government done this time? They have clarified that in the law and said, look, for the purpose of valuation of any such shares, it is to the extent of the value of the Zambian company. Now, that on its own is a game changer in terms of multinationals, because that on its own was really discouraging having a structure that has a leg in Zambia. So it's a big one. It's a big one that I thought I should mention, considering that you mentioned around housekeeping measures that we should have tried to touch, because very few read into them, but the impact is so big.
I have a question, but I'll ask it after the program. Thank you very much for joining us. Next week, I think, continue with discussing the budget. See you next week, 2045. Cabinet TV, continue watching Cabinet TV because Cabinet TV is
not just another channel.
See you next week.